I heard him say it from the hallway, barefoot on the cold tile with a basket of clean laundry cutting into my arm, my heart already racing before my brain could catch up. Because when your husband lowers his voice and says, "Everything will be ready soon, I just need the timing right," you don't think about work or errands or stress. You think about exits. And in that frozen second, I knew with a certainty that made my stomach drop that my marriage wasn't unraveling by accident. It was being dismantled on purpose. And the only question left was how long he'd been planning it without me. I've been reading stories like this for months, telling myself I'd never have one of my own, because my life felt too ordinary, too stable for the kind of betrayal people come here to confess. But I've been carrying this around in my chest for a long time now, and it's gotten too heavy to keep quiet, so I need to let it out. And if you're listening to this thinking it could never happen to you, I used to think the same thing. My name is Amanda Collins, I'm 34 years old, and until a few months ago, I truly believed I was living a normal, stable life, the kind people don't write confessions about, which is probably why it took me so long to admit something was wrong, because I've never been the type to jump to conclusions or imagine betrayal where there isn't any. And for years, my husband Daniel and I looked like that solid couple everyone assumes will be fine. We'd been together 7 years, married for 5, and most of that time things felt easy in a way that makes you careless, because we laughed about stupid inside jokes, argued about what movie to watch, split responsibilities without keeping score, and fell into routines that felt safe instead of dull. And when friends complained about their relationships, I used to listen with quiet confidence, thinking we'd somehow avoided all that. That's why the changes didn't hit me all at once, because they didn't arrive as red flags. They arrived as small shifts I explained away without much effort, starting about 6 months before everything fell apart, when Daniel began carrying his phone everywhere, even to the kitchen or the bathroom, when before he used to leave it on the coffee table for hours without caring who saw it. And I remember teasing him one night while wiping down the counter, asking if he was running a secret operation now, and he laughed and said work had been emailing him nonstop, which sounded reasonable enough that I smiled and dropped it. A few days later, he put a password on his phone, something he'd never bothered with before, and when I casually asked why he gave me a vague answer about privacy and security, and I didn't press, because I didn't want to be that wife who interrogates her husband over nothing, even though something about the timing felt off and lingered in the back of my mind. It didn't stop there, though, and that's the part that still bothers me, because he started taking calls in other rooms, not quietly either. His phone would ring and he'd say, "Let me grab this real quick," before stepping onto the porch or into the bedroom. And if I asked who it was, he'd shrug and say it was someone from work. And I told myself that adults are allowed privacy, that not every conversation is a secret. At the same time, he began to feel distant in ways that were hard to explain without sounding dramatic, because he was still there, still eating dinner with me, still asking about my day, but conversations that used to flow easily now felt strained, and whenever I mentioned the future, even casually like planning a weekend trip or talking about saving for something big, he'd nod and say, "Yeah, we'll see," before changing the subject, and I kept telling myself I was exaggerating, that stress changes people. The first moment I couldn't shake happened on a random Wednesday, when Daniel told me he was meeting a coworker for coffee after work, which didn't sound strange at all, and I happened to be running errands nearby, so I thought I'd surprise him, make it a sweet moment. But when I pulled up near the cafe, he wasn't inside. He was pacing back and forth outside with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and serious, and I stayed in my car because something about the way he spoke made my stomach tighten. I didn't mean to listen, but I heard fragments I couldn't ignore. Things like, "It's almost ready," and "Once the timing's right," and "We'll start fresh." And I had no idea what he was talking about, but it didn't sound like work or casual planning, it sounded deliberate. When he came home that evening, I asked how coffee went, trying to sound normal, and he told me a complete story about his coworker complaining about office politics, and he said it so smoothly that I realized for the first time that he could lie to my face without hesitation. Not long after that, he started asking questions about money, framed as responsibility, not concern, asking where our important documents were, how quickly assets could be accessed, whether everything was still joint, and every time he said it was just being prepared, and every time I told myself I was overthinking it, because preparation sounds harmless until it's happening in secret. And then there I was in the hallway, holding laundry, listening to him talk about timing and readiness, finally understanding what I'd been avoiding for months, that my husband wasn't confused, he wasn't drifting, and he wasn't unsure. He was planning a divorce, and I still didn't know how much time I had left before it was too late for him to win. The next morning felt almost insulting in how normal it was, because Daniel moved around our kitchen like nothing had shifted. Like I hadn't stood in the hallway the night before, listening to him talk about timing, as if our marriage was a project plan. And he asked if I wanted oatmeal or toast, and he rinsed his mug and set it in the drying rack with that exact care he always used. And I watched him from the sink, while my hands worked automatically through a pile of plates, thinking about how calm he looked, how rested, and how easy it would have been to believe him if I hadn't heard what I heard. I kept my voice even when I answered him, and I kept my face relaxed when he kissed my temple on his way out, because I'd already learned that the quickest way to lose control of a situation is to show someone you're afraid. And what I felt wasn't panic so much as a tight, practical awareness, like my mind had switched into a different mode where everything ordinary now had an edge. Even small things like the way he checked his phone before he stepped outside, or how he stood on the porch for an extra minute as if he was waiting for something, then slid it into his pocket and walked to his car with his shoulders loose. Over the next few days, the financial questions didn't stop. They sharpened, and they came at times that felt chosen, like he'd waited until I was tired enough not to resist or busy enough not to push back. And one evening, while I was sorting the mail at the kitchen counter with a grocery list stuck under a magnet, he leaned beside me and asked if I'd ever updated the beneficiary information on my retirement account after we got married. And I remember how I paused with an electric bill in my hand and said I thought it updated automatically when I added him to my insurance, which wasn't even true. It was just a quick answer to move past the moment, and he nodded slowly like he was filing it away. Not relieved, not reassured, just satisfied. The next night, he asked if our savings was still split between the credit union and the big bank downtown. And when I said yes, because we'd kept it that way for years, he asked if it was annoying managing two logins, and I said it didn't bother me. And he gave me that same small smile, the one that looked friendly on the surface but didn't soften his eyes, and he said, "Maybe we should simplify things." Like it was a casual preference, like he was talking about reorganizing a closet. I told myself I was exaggerating. I told myself this was what adults did. They organized, they prepared, they thought ahead, and if the thought of divorce kept trying to rise in my head, I pushed it back down by focusing on practical details: the clink of dishes, the smell of dishwasher soap, the way our dog scratched at the back door exactly at 6 every evening like he had an internal clock. Still, my body kept reacting before my brain could argue it away, my shoulders tightening whenever Daniel stepped out to take a call, my stomach dropping whenever his phone lit up and he angled it away without thinking. One afternoon, he came home earlier than usual, and I heard the garage door rumble up while I was upstairs folding sheets, and by the time I got to the landing, he was halfway up the stairs, smiling like he had good news, and he asked, almost casually, whether the deed to the house was still stored in the hall cabinet, or if we'd moved it somewhere safer, and the question landed wrong, not because it was impossible, but because it came out of nowhere, and because there was a rhythm to these questions now. A steady, intentional beat that made it hard to pretend it was random curiosity. I shrugged and told him it was in the cabinet, and I tried to make my voice light when I added, "Why, are you planning to sell the place without telling me?" And he laughed, a quick sound, then said, "No, I just like knowing where things are." And he walked past me into the bedroom to change his shirt, and that was the moment I felt something cold and clear settle in, because he hadn't asked where things were in years, not once, and suddenly he couldn't stop. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a single lamp on, the rest of the house dark and quiet, and I told myself I was only going to look at our joint account long enough to reassure myself, to prove I was spiraling over nothing. But as soon as the page loaded, I saw the pattern immediately, because the transfers weren't random. They were tidy, repeated, spaced out in a way that made them easy to miss unless you were looking. And they were always just small enough to look harmless, the kind of amounts you could write off as a subscription renewal or a pharmacy run, except there were no notes, no obvious destinations, nothing that fit our usual spending. I clicked into each one, feeling my fingers go cold on the trackpad, and the deeper I went, the more I understood what was unsettling about it. There was intention in the sameness, in the way it happened on certain days and not others, and as I scrolled back through the month, I realized there were more than I'd expected, and I did the math on a notepad beside me, the old-fashioned way, because my brain needed the physical act of writing to stay grounded. The total wasn't catastrophic, not yet. That almost made it worse. Big theft is loud. This was quiet. This was someone practicing. I closed the laptop and stood at the sink, letting cold water run over my hands longer than necessary, staring out at our backyard where the porch light made a small circle on the grass. And I thought about how easy it would be for me to ask him directly, to push the question into the open, but I also thought about the way he'd answered me lately, the smoothness, the calm, the lack of surprise, and I knew, with the same steady certainty I'd felt in the hallway, that if I confronted him now, he'd simply adjust, and whatever he was doing would become harder to see. The next day, I called someone I trusted, not to build a case, not to start a war, but because I needed a reality check from someone who didn't live inside my head, and it was a woman named Tessa who'd been my neighbor years ago, before she switched careers and became a family law paralegal, and we weren't close friends close, but we were close enough that she knew how steady my life usually was, and she listened without interrupting while I described the phone habits, the questions, the transfers, and the phrase I'd overheard, and when I finished, there was a pause that stretched long enough for me to notice the faint buzz of my refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. Tessa didn't tell me what to do. She didn't have to. She just said quietly that when a divorce is coming, people often start by gathering information, especially financial information, because knowledge is leverage, and she asked if Daniel had ever shown this level of interest in the accounts before. And when I said no, she exhaled like she'd already reached her own conclusion, but didn't want to put it in my mouth. Then she said one sentence that stayed with me all day. If something's coming, it usually starts like this. I hung up and went through the rest of the day like I was carrying something fragile, answering emails at work, laughing at a coworker's joke, grabbing a salad from the same deli I always used, and the ordinary details felt almost surreal because I kept thinking about timing, about small transfers, about Daniel's careful questions, and when I came home and saw him in the driveway spraying the winter grime off our car like he had all the time in the world, I had to force myself not to stare too hard at his hands, at his relaxed posture, at the ease in his movements. That evening, he didn't ask a single money question, not once, and the absence of it was its own kind of pressure, because I'd started bracing for those conversations the way you brace for a cold draft, and now the air felt still, too still, and when we sat on the couch watching a show neither of us cared about, he seemed unusually content, his arm resting along the back cushion behind me, his breathing slow, his attention only half on the screen. He looked like someone who'd completed a task. I kept my face neutral and my posture loose, but inside I tracked every second of that calm, trying to understand what it meant. When he finally stood to go upstairs, he paused and asked if I'd locked the back door, and I said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good," in a tone that felt oddly final, and as I listened to his footsteps fade down the hall, I realized that the worst part wasn't what I knew, it was what I didn't, and that the waiting I'd been doing, waiting for him to explain himself, waiting for the truth to surface on its own, was starting to feel less like patience and more like permission. Once the idea settled that something was moving forward without me, I stopped waiting for clarity, not because I suddenly felt brave or decisive, but because waiting had started to feel like participation. Like by staying still, I was agreeing to whatever outcome Daniel had already accepted, and that realization shifted something practical in me, something quiet and controlled, the same part of my mind that takes over in emergencies and focuses not on feelings but on sequence. I didn't change how I acted around him. That part was deliberate. I kept my routines intact, woke up at the same time, made coffee the same way, asked about his day with the same neutral interest, because anything else would have announced that I was alert, and I wasn't ready for him to know that yet. If he was planning, then I needed to understand the scope of it before I made myself visible. The first thing I did was slow down and inventory my own life, mentally at first, then on paper, because once you start looking closely at the structures holding your marriage together, you realize how many of them exist only because you never questioned them. I sat at my desk one evening with a legal pad and wrote my name at the top, then listed everything that was mine. Not emotionally, but legally, methodically, without drama. Accounts, policies, property, documents. It felt strange reducing years of shared life to bullet points, but it also felt grounding because lists don't panic and they don't lie to themselves. I started with the obvious things: my checking account from before the marriage that I'd never closed, my retirement account through work, the small investment account my father had helped me set up years ago. Then I moved on to the things that were shared but complicated: the house, the joint savings, the emergency fund, the car that was technically in both our names, even though I was the one who made the payments. I didn't move anything yet. I just looked. I read statements. I checked dates. I compared balances from month to month the way I might have done if we were planning a refinance, except this time, the intent wasn't growth, it was containment. What surprised me was how calm I felt while doing it. Not numb, not detached, just focused, like my brain had decided that emotional processing would have to wait until the logistics were under control. I didn't feel angry yet. Anger needs certainty. What I felt was a steady pressure, the sense that timing mattered, that every day I delayed understanding my position was a day Daniel had already used. He, meanwhile, seemed to ease. The question stopped completely. No more casual mentions of accounts or documents, no more interest in where things were stored. If anything, he grew lighter, more relaxed, coming home earlier, suggesting takeout, even laughing more than he had in months, and that shift confirmed what I hadn't wanted to say out loud. Whatever information he'd been gathering, he believed he had enough. That was the moment I decided not to confront him at all. Not yet. Confrontation would only tell him that I was catching up, and if there was one thing I understood clearly by then, it was that he valued being ahead. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor I'd worked with briefly years ago, under the pretense of general planning, because even making the appointment felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, and I needed it to be clean, ordinary, defensible. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't say the word divorce. I just asked questions about asset protection, about what was possible, what was reversible, what was time sensitive. I listened more than I spoke, and when the meeting ended, I walked out with a folder of information and the unsettling clarity that preparation wasn't betrayal, it was response. At home, I continued to act unchanged. I folded his laundry. I reminded him about his sister's birthday. I nodded through conversations about work I barely listened to. If he noticed anything different in me, he didn't say it. But I noticed him watching me sometimes, just briefly, like he was checking for a reaction that never came, and each time I caught it, I made sure my expression was neutral, my tone steady, because uncertainty makes people reckless, and I didn't want him to feel uncertain yet. Over the next several days, I began moving carefully, not money at first, but information. I gathered documents quietly, slipping copies into a folder I kept at work instead of home. Statements, deeds, account summaries. I didn't rush. Rushing creates mistakes. I moved slowly enough that nothing felt sudden, that nothing would trigger alerts or questions. Every action had a reason I could explain if I ever had to, and that mattered to me more than speed. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was the silence. Living beside someone who doesn't know you've stepped out of sync with them is a peculiar kind of loneliness, because you're still sharing meals and space, but you're no longer sharing reality. I'd sit across from him at dinner, listening to him talk about a coworker or a project, and I'd think about how easily this version of our life could disappear, how fragile it was, and how unaware he seemed that I was no longer standing where he thought I was. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not my friends, not my sister, not even Tessa. Preparation felt private, almost intimate, and I wasn't ready to have it shaped by anyone else's fear or opinion. The only person I involved was my mother, and even then I didn't tell her everything. I called her one afternoon while driving home from work, my voice steady, and said I needed her help with some paperwork, that I might need to temporarily place a few things in her name for administrative reasons. I didn't use the word divorce. I didn't accuse Daniel of anything. I said it was precautionary. She paused. Of course she did, because mothers hear what you don't say more clearly than what you do, but she didn't push. She just asked if I was okay. I said yes. It wasn't a complete lie, it was an incomplete truth. That weekend, while Daniel was out running errands, I sat at the dining table with my laptop and finalized the steps I'd been mapping out all week. I moved what I legally could, quietly and correctly, the way you do when you know something might be questioned later and you want every decision to stand on its own. I didn't drain accounts. I didn't make dramatic shifts. I redistributed. I secured. I documented. Each transfer felt less like a victory and more like a closing door, and with every confirmation screen, I felt the weight of what I was accepting settle deeper in my chest. When he came home that afternoon, bags of groceries in his hands, he smiled and asked what I wanted to do for dinner, and I told him I was thinking pasta, and he said that sounded good, and nothing in his face suggested he sensed anything had changed. That was when I understood how invisible preparation can be to someone who believes they're in control. Over the next few days, he seemed almost relieved. He stopped checking his phone so obsessively. He didn't take as many calls outside. He even brought up future adjacent things again. Not plans exactly, but comments, like maybe we should replace the couch next year, or that he might finally take a long vacation once work settled down. And those remarks confused me at first, until I realized they weren't meant to be shared plans. They were placeholders, the kind of casual optimism people use when they believe the hard part is already handled. I watched him closely during that time, not suspiciously, but attentively, the way you watch a situation when you know you're missing information, and I noticed how relaxed he was, how unguarded, how the tension I'd felt for months seemed to have drained out of him completely. That calm told me more than any document ever could. Whatever he thought was coming, he believed it was already decided. One evening, while we were brushing our teeth side by side, he looked at me in the mirror and said I seemed less stressed lately, and I smiled and said maybe I'd just gotten better at not worrying about things I couldn't control. And he nodded, satisfied, like that explanation fit neatly into whatever version of reality he was carrying. The irony wasn't lost on me. By the end of the second week, everything I needed to do quietly had been done. Nothing dramatic had happened, no doors had slammed, no arguments had broken out. On the surface, our life looked calmer than it had in months, and that was the strangest part, because underneath that calm, I could feel the structure of our marriage shifting, settling into a shape that no longer included trust, only timing. The night before everything changed, Daniel cooked dinner, something he hadn't done in a while, and he poured wine and asked about my day with what sounded like genuine interest. And for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything, if I'd misread the signs and built an entire contingency plan around nothing. But then I remembered the transfers, the questions, the phone call, the calm, and I knew better. When we went to bed, he fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and even, and I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, not thinking about what I'd done, but about what he still believed he was going to do. And it occurred to me then, not with anger but with clarity, that whatever his plan was, it had already reached the point of no return, and he just didn't know yet that he wasn't the only one who'd been preparing. The mediation room was quiet in that careful, manufactured way, the kind of quiet meant to signal neutrality, fairness, professionalism, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the most significant unraveling of my marriage was happening in a beige room with a water pitcher and a box of tissues no one touched. Daniel sat across from me with his attorney beside him, his posture relaxed, almost casual, like this was a formality he'd already mentally completed. And when he nodded at me, it wasn't unkind, just confident, as if he believed we were both playing roles we'd agreed on. His attorney spoke first, laying everything out in a clear, measured voice, detailing what Daniel was requesting. Half of everything. Adjustments based on projected income, considerations that leaned heavily in his favor, and as I listened, I didn't feel anger so much as a dull confirmation, because every demand matched the months of quiet preparation I'd witnessed, the questions, the transfers, the timing. This wasn't negotiation to him, it was execution. When it was our turn, my attorney didn't argue. He didn't counter. He simply slid a folder across the table and said there were documents that needed to be reviewed before any discussion could continue. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, but I saw it in Daniel's eyes as he glanced down, a flicker of confusion that quickly tried to reorganize itself into control. His attorney began flipping through the pages, slowly at first, then faster, his expression tightening with each turn, and when he finally looked up, it wasn't at me, it was at Daniel, and the silence stretched long enough to feel heavy. He asked where these documents had come from, and my attorney answered calmly that they documented asset transfers completed prior to the divorce filing, transfers that were legal, documented, and already finalized. Daniel leaned forward, reaching for the papers, and I watched his confidence fracture in real time as he scanned the dates, the signatures, the confirmations, and when he looked at me again, there was something raw in his face that hadn't been there before, disbelief giving way to anger. He said my name like an accusation and asked if I'd planned this, if I'd known he was going to file and moved things deliberately to block him. I didn't answer. There was nothing to explain, and more importantly, nothing to defend. My attorney spoke instead, clarifying timelines, reiterating legality, outlining how the assets in question were no longer subject to division in the way Daniel had assumed. And with every sentence, the plan Daniel had been so certain of collapsed quietly in on itself. His attorney asked for a break. When we stepped out into the hallway, Daniel followed me, his voice low and tight, saying this wasn't over, saying I'd blindsided him, saying this wasn't fair. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and what struck me wasn't his anger, but his confusion. The way someone looks when a strategy fails and they don't yet know how to recalibrate. I told him calmly that I hadn't done anything to him, that I'd only protected myself, and that was the last conversation we had without lawyers present. After that, everything moved quickly, not because it was easy, but because there was nothing left to argue. The leverage he thought he had was gone. The aggressive demands softened, then disappeared. The tone shifted from assertive to cautious, from confident to resigned. The divorce was finalized without ceremony, without drama, just signatures and confirmations, and the quiet acknowledgement that whatever he'd planned had not unfolded the way he'd expected. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to reframe the story. At first it was regret, messages about talking things through, about how things had gotten out of hand. When that didn't work, it became blame, accusations that I'd been calculating, that I'd betrayed his trust. I didn't respond. Silence had served me well before, and it continued to do so now. What I hadn't planned for was how abruptly everything else would change. Mutual friends grew distant, conversations cooled, invitations stopped coming, not out of loyalty to him or me, but because people don't like standing too close to a story that forces them to question their assumptions. His family stopped reaching out entirely. Mine was supportive but careful, unsure how much to ask or say. Life didn't snap back into place just because the paperwork was done. I kept the house. I kept my financial stability. I kept the version of my future that I could still recognize as mine. But what I lost was the illusion that trust protects you from strategy, that love makes planning unnecessary. I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact, which is different and quieter and harder to explain. The last time I saw Daniel was weeks later, when he came to collect the last of his things. We stood in the doorway exchanging polite words, avoiding eye contact, and before he left, he said he never thought I'd be capable of what I'd done. I didn't correct him. Capability is often invisible until it's required. When the door closed behind him, the house felt larger, not emptier, and as I stood there listening to the quiet settle, I understood that I hadn't won anything in the traditional sense. I had simply refused to lose what he'd already decided was his to take.